Joe Smith Jr. wants your cookies, and he'll knock you through the ropes if he's got to get them. Knuckleheads, welcome to the Fighters Rep, where we give you free fights, interviews in the fight game, and fight commentary from the mind of a promoter. Man, I absolutely had to make a clip about Joe Smith Jr. because I felt like I would be remiss and the boxing community would be remiss to forget about such a fantastic blue collar, all hard work, elbow grease type of fighter. I mean, this guy epitomizes a tough guy. He's a full-time fighter. He works full-time construction, and he's got a tree servicing business with his father. And the guy somehow still manages to toil away at the highest level of boxing's light heavyweight division. I had to make this clip because on Saturday, Joe Smith Jr. went in there as the underdog again against a very capable Eleider Alvarez. And if that name sounds familiar to you, Eleider Alvarez is the guy who became light heavyweight champion after knocking out Sergey Kovalev, but then lost it in the rematch. But Joe Smith Jr. went in there against a very capable Eleider Alvarez, a guy who'd never been stopped, a guy who I believe was 25-1 at the time. And Joe Smith Jr. came forward, pressured him, made Eleider Alvarez fight on the back foot, a guy who typically looks to counterpunch, put so much overwhelming pressure and power on Eleider Alvarez that he ended up breaking him for the first time in his career in the 9th round, knocking him through the ropes. And this has become a pattern for Joe Smith, or at least the second time he does it, where he knocks a former world champion through the ropes. And if we remember who he knocked through the ropes first, it was the great Bernard Hopkins, sending him up and through the ropes and into retirement. Joe Smith Jr. is just an absolute beast, a guy I admire not because of his power and perseverance and how grimy and how much of a grinder he is, but I admire the guy because you can tell, and Teddy Atlas is absolutely right when he says this, he doesn't have the sort of skills that you see from the top tier fighters, but he makes up for that in conditioning, in power, in pressure, in heart, in just being a fighter. Now, where I will disagree with Teddy Atlas is, despite the fact that Joe Smith doesn't have the boxing skills, I wouldn't say what Teddy Atlas said, which is that he didn't get the best part of the gene pool. I've actually got to disagree with that 100 to 200% on this one. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, having skills, is more something that you attain through years and years and years of practice. And Joe Smith Jr. just never had the amateur pedigree a guy like Dimitri Bivol did, a guy who beat Joe Smith Jr. He never had the amateur pedigree a guy like Artur Beterbiev did, another champion in the light heavyweight division. But Joe Smith was certainly not shortchanged genetically as far as the gene pool goes because, when you look at this guy, Joe Smith Jr. is a 6 foot tall light heavyweight that looks like he's got a reach of about 80 inches. I mean, the guy's in there and he just looks like a freaking pterodactyl. The guy looks like he could punch you from the other side of the ring. Now, I agree that he doesn't have the boxing skills, again, at the level of a Beterbiev or level of a Dimitri Bivol, because he just didn't have that amateur program to program into him, right? But this guy's physique, this guy's relentless pace, this guy's determination, this guy's length, this guy's power. I mean, he could punch with both hands. hard. He's got a tremendous reach. This guy definitely has all the physical gifts, and I actually believe that that's part of the reason that he's been so successful. The physical gifts that he has naturally, combined with his mentality, his discipline, his perseverance, his toughness, his power. And no doubt that a lot of that power may come from working construction. I mean, this is a guy who works construction full-time and boxes full-time. So while I agree that his boxing skills are not at the elite level, I feel like physically, he's a very physically strong, physical specimen. I mean, there's just no denying it. There's just no denying this guy. And one thing that I really noticed in the fight between him and Bivol was the difference in their reach, the difference in the physicality. Now, Bivol is just so intelligent that he's able to overcome it. But my goodness, if you go back and watch that fight, it looks like Bivol's arms are just like 2/3 the length of Joe Smith. And then on top of it, I mean, the guy's built like a tank, but he's long and he's got that leverage that gives him power as well. You know, it's very much like a Deontay Wilder or like a Tommy Hearns type build. He's long, he's gangly, but he's very muscular. And I gotta disagree with the notion that this guy got the short end of the gene pool. The only issue is, you know, are his skills going to be enough for him to make it to the top of the light heavyweight division? He absolutely crushed Eleider Alvarez, and I do believe that coming up there's going to be a mandatory for the WBO belt that, or a vacancy fight for the WBO belt that Canelo Alvarez dropped. And it looks like two guys that don't really have a name, and it looks like Joe Smith will be fighting the winner of those two guys. And I do think Joe Smith can become WBO champion. But will he be able to beat a Dmitry Bivol? Will he be able to beat an Artur Beterbiev? I think that's a little bit far-fetched. As much as I like Joe Smith Jr., as much as I admire him, I don't think that he's going to be able to beat Dmitry Bivol. They've already fought, and we saw Bivol just completely outclass him. And I definitely don't think he's going to be able to beat a guy like Artur Beterbiev, who I think not only has the skills, but has the toughness and the physicality and the strength of anybody. I mean, the guy's up there with anybody and is an absolute physical specimen himself. But yes, Joe Smith Jr., I do think will probably become the next WBO light heavyweight champion, assuming the two guys, you know, that fight for that title, you know, fight him at some point. But my goodness, Joe Smith Jr., man, is just a beast. Joe Smith Jr. is just a beast. Knuckleheads, tell me what you think about Joe Smith Jr. Tell me if you believe that he can become light heavyweight champion. Tell me if you disagree with me and think he can beat a Bivol or a Beterbiev. I mean, I'm saying there's a chance, but I don't like the chance. Tell me what you think about this guy, man. This guy's a special guy. He's here for your cookies. He's not leaving without them. And Teddy Atlas calls him no free lunch. I'm going to call him the Cookie Snatcher. Tell me which nickname you like better. If you haven't already, hit the subscribe button, the bell notification icon next to it. Join Knucklehead Nation. I'll see you guys soon.